Good afternoon, everyone. And for those joining online, welcome back to the Sustaining Access Conference. We're delighted to have you here. And thanks to all our guests for joining in person for today's panel on humanitarian aid in Afghanistan. I'm Marty Flax. I am the director of our Human Rights Initiative here at CSIS and Khosravi Chair in Principled Internationalism. And I'm delighted to be moderating this panel with a fantastic lineup of experts. This is a discussion that does not require a lot of framing, particularly for an audience that I know is following this issue very closely. But I think it's worth reiterating that since the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan just over 18 months ago, the consequences for Afghan civilians have been dire. We've seen a dramatic increase in humanitarian aid necessity, more than 28 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, widespread human rights abuse, an economy that has essentially bottomed out. And while abuse and challenges are facing every segment of the Afghan population, women and girls have been particularly targeted, not just for speaking out for their human rights, but for trying to go about their lives, for trying to get an education, for trying to go to work, earn money for their families, and by trying to participate in civic life as any other citizen. The Taliban's recent decrees that have banned women from working in humanitarian aid organizations and now from working at the UN have made what was already an extraordinarily challenging humanitarian environment nearly impossible. And so we're here with a group of extraordinary experts to talk through and unpack what that means for humanitarian assistance and operations in Afghanistan, how to get the life-saving and necessary assistance to people in need while trying to respect human rights and international norms. I'm going to briefly introduce each of our panelists, and then we're going to dive into a conversation. We're going to leave some room at the end for questions. So for folks in the room, you'll be able to get a microphone and ask your question live. For folks who are online, there is a submit question button on our website. Please use it to send your questions over, and we'll get those up here on stage. So with no further ado, let me introduce our fantastic lineup of speakers. To my immediate left, we have Vicki Aiken, former director of the International Rescue Committee in Afghanistan for the past 6 years, literally until a few weeks ago, very recently on the ground, and we're delighted to have your real-time experience working in Afghanistan with us. To her left is Ella Watson-Stryker, the humanitarian representative for Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF. After a long 15-year career in the field, she is now here helping us, policymakers and other analysts, understand what's happening on the ground and create smarter, better policies. And then to my right, we have Ashley Jackson, co-director for the Center on Armed Groups, who focuses not just on armed groups, conflict, and peace building, but also the intersection of humanitarian and international aid. Recently wrote a book, I understand, on Afghanistan, Negotiating Survival, Civilian Insurgent Relations in Afghanistan. So pick a copy of that up when you get a chance. And then we will have a fourth panelist who is joining us as we speak, and I'm going to introduce her as she's joining us because we're so delighted to have her as well. And that... Metra, thanks so much for joining us. Metra Mehran is an Afghan human rights activist who's focused on women's empowerment, human rights and justice, and political accountability. She's the founder of the Feminine Perspectives movement in the context of the Afghan peace negotiations and is now a non-resident fellow at New York University. So thank you all for joining us. Let me start with a question to my colleagues here on the left in terms of just help us setting the stage for what's happening right now in Afghanistan and the experience that humanitarian aid organizations are having. So Vicki, maybe I'll start with you. Just give us an overview of the challenges that the IRC has faced in providing aid in Afghanistan since the Taliban took over, and what has changed or evolved since the ban on humanitarian aid workers in terms of the impact on your services.
Yeah, when the Taliban first took over, aside from the difficulties of getting cash into the country, which was incredibly difficult, access was better than it had been in the entire time I've been in Afghanistan. We were able to go into rural areas we hadn't been able to get to before. The safety and security was better, and in the initial meetings with the de facto government, they were open to whatever we wanted to do in the initial months. Yet we all knew that was a honeymoon period while they were consolidating. You also never heard from the emir, like the first 6 months to a year, or really until the girls' secondary education ban. And once that happened, things started to get more and more difficult for NGOs to operate. They started scrutinizing. They tried to bring back the monitoring and control plan on NGOs, which was proposed by the previous government as well. And then slowly started to restrict more and more of what we could do, till we got to December 24th, when they instituted the ban on female aid workers, which we all thought might come at some point, but we didn't expect it to happen quite so quickly, and specifically right after the ban on higher education for women. So IRC had suspended for 2 weeks, and then the Ministry of Public Health made it very clear to us that we don't know why you suspended, because there was never a ban for women in the healthcare sector. So if you're not going to go back to work, what are you even doing here? So we restarted our health programs first, and then gradually had to negotiate program by program. So not just in health and education, but in livelihoods and in all of the other sectors. We were able to negotiate, so most of the programming, at least in some places, is back up and running. But the issue now is that it's all about negotiating access every day, every minute, with every person that you meet. So you can't just negotiate with the Ministry of Economy and sign your MOU and operate. You have to negotiate at the central level, at the provincial level, at the district level, at the village level, and you have to negotiate not only with your line ministries, but you have to also talk to GDI, and you have to talk to MOI, and you have to, and then they might change the person that you just negotiated with after 2 or 3 months, and you have to start all over again. So while there is space for women to continue working in different capacities, in some provinces we might even be able to have them in the offices. In some provinces they need to go from their homes directly to the field. And at any point in going out to the field, the women could be stopped they could be stopped by GDI, even though you have permissions from 5 other people to continue with that work. And one of the paths that we chose, because we had over 3,000 Afghan women working for us across the country. So the statements early on about we will not replace our women with men is fairly empty if you only have 2 or 3 women on your staff to begin with. It has to go beyond that. And many organizations took the stand that the red line, if you will be that we have to be able to deliver aid to women in a meaningful way. How that happens is negotiable. Where that happens is negotiable. But completely stopping altogether until you get a central agreement is not an option for the women of Afghanistan, because if you talk to the women inside, they want opportunities where those opportunities arise. And as I mentioned, we have 3,000 women to be responsible for having them be able to have a job, for having them feel safety and have dignity. And it's really important that the international community stays there and fights for that ability for women to do that.
Thanks. And I want to come back to this question of how you navigate the opportunities for women and keep them safe while doing it. But I want to also bring in Ella to get your experience from the MSF perspective. Has it been similar to the negotiations that IRC has undertaken, or have you had a different experience?
I think in the initial aftermath, we also had this similar experience, which is that it was safer to move around the country. And so we could also access places that we hadn't been able to access before. But it also meant that people could travel to receive healthcare. And so we saw people coming from significant distances away, and people who had been really delaying seeking medical care while the conflict had been so intense. So that was a big change initially when the Taliban took over, is just this increased demand on medical services. We've seen that continue actually for a few different reasons. So the economic reasons that Vicky mentioned as well. The fact that aid has long been politicized in Afghanistan, and the political actors who underwrote the health system withdrew when the Taliban took over, meant that there were fewer people, fewer organizations, and less money available to provide medical care. So for us, the experience has been a really struggle to expand our operations. We've expanded to new locations. We've also expanded existing hospital services to provide new and different services, but also just to have more beds and have a higher bed capacity for patients. We've always had to negotiate every step of the work that we did in Afghanistan. I think the complexity of the negotiations now is very similar to what Vicki is describing. But the good point is there are still channels through which we can negotiate. So that would be sort of the positive I can find in the current situation.
Just to follow up briefly to each of you, have you encountered situations where those negotiations were not successful, where you haven't been able to find a way to keep your employees working or keep your access, or is it you've always found a workaround so far in terms of access?
So this is where the flexibility comes in, that it's so important to be flexible to continue your programs wherever and however you can, because next week it might change and you might get permission. So in one province, before the ban on women, we had been negotiating for 3 months to restart our women's livelihoods program, and we're getting no, no, no. Then the ban happened, and all of a sudden we got permission to restart our livelihoods programs for women, which would make no sense, but it's the sense that it makes is that new people come in and different people are there to give permission. So it's really important that you keep at the negotiations and don't take any rash decisions immediately, because the situation could change the following week.
Yeah, is that your sense as well? Yeah.
I mean, a no is a beginning point for a negotiation, right? That's the only way to work in humanitarian contexts. I think the other piece is that for MSF, we're in a slightly different situation in that we're not registered as an NGO, we're registered as an international organization. So we haven't had as much pressure as those organizations registered as NGOs, because we're working with a different line ministry, but we are well aware things could change at any time. We don't take it for granted that we've faced relatively less pressure. We have continued all of our operations. In fact, we've expanded the work that we're doing, and more than half of our medical staff are women, and they are still showing up to work every day and doing the life-saving work that they need to do. So that hasn't changed, and we're doing everything we can to maintain that capacity.
Thanks. Let me bring in Ashley. So you spent a long time researching the dynamics between the Taliban and civilians. You know, as our other panelists are talking about the different attitudes of different sections of the government, federal government, local government, even if different individuals that they might be negotiating with day to day or week to week. How are you seeing that play out in terms of Taliban decision making? What's your assessment of when they put an edict out like no women in the in international aid organizations? What's the pushback that they're getting from their own population? Is that influencing how robustly they enforce it depending on the local context, or what's driving that difference of opinion, difference of action?
Well, the short answer is it's really complicated. And without getting too much into the weeds of Taliban dynamics or the political economy in Afghanistan right now, I would agree very strongly with Vicky and Emma. The space for negotiation is narrowing. And there's this environment where everyone's really, really unsure about what happens next. You can, as a female businesswoman, you can run your business technically, but there are a million things that can happen. Or you're allowed to return to work, or you're allowed to do something, but you don't know what's going to happen next week. And I think this is what really struck me when I was last in Kabul a few weeks ago, or about 2 months ago. This sense of uncertainty, which means that people kind of have to have 18 different contingency plans, the way that Afghans themselves who don't have an option, who can't leave, have to kind of come up with backup plan after backup plan as to how they're going to kind of survive and withstand the next hit. I think that said, though, the Taliban is not a monolith, right? The government, the government is full of civil servants who are there under the Republic. It's full of fighters from the field or real Taliban officials who don't, who have different preferences, have different thoughts about this. And when the Taliban was in an insurgency, there was no blueprint for the day after. They hadn't gotten to that yet. So what they did was assume control of the Republic structures. And for the first 6 months, a year, things sort of ticked along in various states of functionality and consistency. But what you see now is the emir, or the circle around him, establishing more control. These edicts are coming, right? And that creates this uncertainty of whatever we thought we had or could do, or the space that was left for hope or negotiation, looks much more precarious. That said, what I think I was most struck by when I went back to Afghanistan was how much people were doing anyway, and how smart Afghans are, and how brave in terms of taking whatever room there is to negotiate and to push back and to subvert, and under great risk, and I don't want to romanticize it, but under sort of great risk and pressure, using that, not necessarily always marching in the streets given how high the risks are, but finding ways, running women's shelters, doing things because they have to, because it's their country, because. So I think it's a really nuanced picture, and yeah, I don't want to be too pessimistic because I think there's always reason for hope, and it lies in that, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great opportunity, Metra, to bring you in and get your perspective on how Afghans are responding to this increasingly precarious and ever-changing environment, and where you're seeing real action that's working. And I'd be curious as well where you're seeing international action that has been helpful in coming in behind and providing assistance and providing necessary aid. So I'd love your perspective on that.
Thank you so much. So thank you for the good work all of you are doing on daily basis inside Afghanistan. But things are very hard, and for us, I think it's emotionally torturing too. Because everything that we talk about, maybe at the bigger picture, looks fine, or at least looks as working with negotiations and finding a way around the decrease of Taliban. But then Afghanistan is very diverse, very localized, and then if you contextualize it, vulnerable groups, marginalized people, who are religious minorities, women, are not having access to humanitarian aid as much as they should. Even if because I personally, for example, work with women protesters, mainly who the ones who are imprisoned and tortured. And then there is no way that we can get them money inside Afghanistan, even through Hawala, because they cannot go and get money. Now imagine their families, their extended families don't have access to aid. The families of previous military people, they don't have access to any aid. Aid is not, there is many reports by local newspapers, Zan Times and Itla'at Ruz has really good reports that to some of the provinces that are predominantly Hazaras and Tajiks, the aid actually doesn't go equally there for the people. And then even the aid that goes mainly to South, it doesn't go to other people, not to all people in the South, but mainly to the Taliban family members who comes from the South. So these are, when you see the context and contextualize everything, even if we feel that we are working around the decrease, it's de facto denial of access, to those aid. At the same time, even if we, for example, consider the Taliban, it's really hard that you want to have a principled goal with a very unprincipled group, So that is very hard. So, and if you don't have the freedom of movement, if you don't have the freedom of, interacting with a person who is not from your sex, there is no way then you have access to that aid. Even if subcontractors maybe deliver some reports, right? that they have, for example, distributed aid to the people, but then their reporting, their distribution, everything is monitored by the Taliban in that village or in that province, who were previously, as she rightly mentioned, were insurgent fighters. They don't know the rule. They're not reporting to anyone. They're not even, and then the Taliban leader is afraid also to not go that much against them, because we hear this every day that if Taliban members in local level says if Taliban are going against whatever we used to do and we are doing now, we're just going to go and become ISIS, right? Daesh. So that is as simple as that. So that's why my focus has always been, we need to talk at the policy level too. Even this new humanitarianism principle that talks about, maybe there is a dilemma about it, but I think we should consider it case specific, and in case of Afghanistan, we should condition aid in relation to its implications with the long-term political and human rights issues. That's my understanding. I come from Afghanistan. United States have been heavily involved in every matter we do. So if you talk with a taxi driver in Kabul or in any province, they won't believe that they have a say in their destiny. They're like, if the US or international community make a decision to bring Taliban and are supporting them, they will do. So psychologically, when 40 million or around 80 million on a weekly basis go to the Taliban and they take the picture with cash, and put it on their social media, how we expect people to resist, right? How we expect people to feel that there is a way for them to keep these people accountable. So I think women, marginalized group, religion minorities, LGBTQ communities that they're totally maybe gone now or hidden, are the ones that we need to also discuss when we are talking about aid. What bothers me sometimes is we always talk how we work around the decrease the Taliban issue, but we never talk about how we work around these issues of that we reach to this vulnerable group, that we reach to this woman. I think if we localize it, if we contextualize it, women and men and those people are going to find a way. So the most important thing for me as a person is that I be able to go back to Afghanistan, right? That my sisters living in there have a say. So that's why for me is we need to make sure that the aid that goes to Afghanistan at a bigger policy level should be conditioned, And then we shouldn't only be focused. We are like, everyone, when Taliban gives a decree, when Taliban regime, everyone accepted. And they're like, let's work around it. Why we never discuss that we shouldn't accept it sometimes, right? Because they are dependent to this money. There is so much leverage, I believe, that we can use that we are not using it. So I think for the long-term, humanitarian aid is not something that's going to help Afghanistan, and we cannot sustain that country with aid forever. But in the short term, I think it's important, as much as we talk about finding ways to work with Taliban, is finding ways to empower people. So Taliban have to be, responsive to the people at some time if we empower them, if we listen to them, if we allow them to navigate their own cultural, social, ethnic ways that they have within those communities.
Yeah, thanks, Mitra. So this question of leverage is one that often comes up. Do we have tools and resources internationally to influence the Taliban? The UN last week said that it's making plans to pull out of Afghanistan if the Taliban doesn't reverse its ban on women working for the UN. I would love to get all of your views about if you care to weigh in on, is that the right move? And then for the folks who are working in this space, what are the implications of that for you on the ground? What will that mean if the UN pulls its staff out, its financial transaction support and things like that? I don't know if Ella and if you want to come in. Yeah, or if you want, at least on the second question. Yeah.
The UN isn't going to pull out in May. They aren't. A lot of that has been going around, was based on a Guardian article that was based on a misquote. So, nor should they. It's important that So if you look at the 1990s when they took a very hard stand saying, the Taliban saying they're not going to educate women, so we're not going to fund education at all, and yet there were so many schools for girls that were actually there and happening and weren't struggled to get funding. So what they should be doing is looking at how can you fund those actions that are being carried out in a principled way, that are reaching ethnic minorities, that are reaching women. That's one. The other is we are absolutely terrible at localization. I mean, they were talking about the grand bargain this morning. I'm sorry, but we have a very, very long way to go. If you give money to one or two big local NGOs and call that localization, that's not really localization. That's just a replication of what's in the system. And unfortunately, one of the things that happened when the Taliban took over, all of the programs that we're funding, these really small, truly local, maybe only existing on working on sexual and reproductive rights in a district in Lochman, for example, women-led organizations all lost their funding. It was all cut off. And now getting humanitarian funding is not easy. Yes, they're trying to develop programs for women-led CSOs that will just fund their ability to exist, like $5,000 or $10,000, some of them. That's all that they need just to maintain a civil society. But getting them that money with all of our compliance and everything else that has to go around that has, I mean, it's September 21 and now we're in April 2023 and we haven't really figured that out. And meanwhile, these organizations are dying. And we're losing the civil society that has been built up. And it's those organizations that are on the ground that we could use in monitoring and evaluation to ensure that women are getting the aid that they need, that it's not all going to the families of the Taliban. But we haven't figured that out yet, and that's where we need to put our energies.
Do you want to comment on that?
The UN leaving would be catastrophic, but I agree, this is not the thing to focus on. The thing to focus on is what it means for the UN to stay and how they can best work. And one of the things that governments need to do is not use the UN as the political actor at the same time that they want them to be the humanitarian actor. Governments really need to take responsibility for their own political agendas and have those dialogues, those political conversations directly with the Taliban and authorities, and not think that the UN can be the be-all, end-all for everyone and every government. We need the UN as a humanitarian actor, and we need to protect that space. The UN, MSF is frequently criticizing the UN, but and we will continue to do so. That's part of our responsibility in the humanitarian sector. But we also recognize the enormous pressure that they are under in Afghanistan and the very difficult balance that they have to strike in the situation that they're in. We see UN agencies struggling to meet really intense needs, and that economic collapse has driven many Afghans into a very desperate economic state. Those who are lucky enough to have a job are employing not only their immediate, or are supporting not only their immediate families, but their extended families. Many people are relying on single incomes. People are relying on food assistance at rates that we haven't seen before, and we are treating more and more people for malnutrition. Not just children, which is sort of the first group to experience malnutrition, but we're also seeing women in states of severe malnutrition. So we really need to be focused on getting people the assistance that they need to survive, and getting them the assistance they need to continue to live in dignity.
It's interesting, this point about the role of the UN, because of course the UN has many hats, including in Afghanistan. So they play a vital humanitarian role, but they do have a political role there. We had the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights here last week, Volker Turk, talking about Afghanistan and their role in documenting human rights abuse and his view on whether and how the UN can continue to work there, which is maybe a little bit different, as you might expect. But there are a lot of different components of the UN that they have to navigate internally as well, how to balance. while I understand the point about the humanitarian role that they play, I wonder how, if and how that's from the perspective of engaging the Taliban, can you really separate out the other responsibilities that they have at the political level?
Can I just
Yeah.
follow up on that?
Yeah.
I think that there's a difference. When you're putting the political and humanitarian responsibilities in the same person often, how do you expect the Taliban to realize, oh, he's here with his humanitarian hat on, not with his political hat? That's one thing. But the other thing that is happening is that since the international political actors have all left Afghanistan, for the most part, with the exception of the EU, the Taliban are turning to the humanitarian community and the humanitarian UN agencies and treating us as if we are the representatives. And we're the only ones that they can talk to face, and that's politicizing us in a way that we don't, on a role that we don't want to play.
That's an important point. Actually, I'll bring in Metra as well in a moment, but actually I want to ask you this question too in terms of how the international community can more effectively engage the Taliban in terms of where you see opportunities for leverage and who are the right actors to wield that leverage. It's obviously not the humanitarian aid community to negotiate the political situation in Afghanistan, but who do you think could effectively engage them?
Well, I don't think they care about aid. I don't think aid is leverage. They've proved that. But I think after this misquote about the UN leaving, there was a really interesting statement from a Taliban spokesman, and the last line was, "We Afghans can stand on our own 2 feet," which appeals to something Metra hit on, of like this feeling of your destiny being in the hands of foreigners the entire time, or in the hands of people you don't want governing you in many cases. So I think there's this misconception that like aid is leverage in Afghanistan, and it almost has never been. It definitely isn't with the Taliban. And what I find really problematic is when governments who claim to care about the Afghan people, claim to care about the situation, maybe in fact do, use aid and politicize aid in ways. And we've seen humanitarian aid, well, it's always been politicized in Afghanistan, but this is a new phase of it, the kinds of conditions that are placed on it, the fact that donors kind of leave the UN and leave humanitarians out in the open knowing. I mean, if you engage the Taliban in a political process, no one really has much optimism in terms of that being successful, but you would release the pressure off of humanitarians. If you think these bans on women are just about Taliban ideology, you are dead wrong. They're about politics. And yet everyone's dealing with them as though they're this kind of, oh, we can find workarounds, which is I think, important because people still need healthcare services. And again, if the Taliban doesn't care, you're really just punishing Afghans. And you're using that to make a stand in the absence of actually having a political strategy to help Afghans. And the same with Vicki's comments about localization. Look, if you wanted to help Afghan women, if you wanted to help these community-based organizations, you would have done it a year and a half ago. But you aren't. And so a lot of that, like these empty statements, there's so many ways to kind of try to stand up for your principles in an impossible situation where there are very few right answers about how to solve it, I appreciate. But I find a lot of political hypocrisy from the US, from other donor governments, not from the donor agencies that are trying to help and in a very tough position. But I think, I just think the Taliban as a government, as an authority, whatever you want to call it, aid is not leverage, but they are acting out politically, and we're not engaging with that reality or with the right analysis of how to engage, and that's a political problem. That's not down to humanitarianisms, and I don't know if cutting off aid is the right thing to do. I don't know what the right thing to do is, but
That's where I was gonna go next, which is and maybe I'll ask Metra this question too, which is how do you influence a government can you influence a government to care about its people that inherently doesn't care about its people?
I don't think I don't think that's what's going on here. I don't think we're going to influence any government to do that with humanitarian aid, ever, possibly.
Outside the realm of the deployment of humanitarian aid, it's a sort of broader question of do you see an opportunity to change the situation, or are we really talking about working around what's going to be a terrible situation for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, I just think if there was a political process, we could evaluate that. But there's no political process with the Taliban. It's a lot of donor governments kind of throwing up their hands, not doing everything they can on the humanitarian side, and not doing much productively on the political side. So I would love to find out is the answer. I would love to see more people on all sides trying to kind of shake things up with more energy, with more political courage. You know, whatever direction that takes. I don't profess to have any answers. I'll leave that to Metra.
Let me bring you in on this same question.
So it's a very polarized issue, even within Afghanistan. But before going to this, I want to just mention on the UN thing. The thing is, all the UN bodies, UNOM are supposed to do some political work. UCHO need to do the coordination for humanitarian aid, and then all of them are doing the same thing. Everyone is busy with their humanitarian aid, maybe because there is some money, or maybe because there is enough attention or need or demand. But we needed UNOMA to do a better job. Even though I was one of the people who went to New York and advocated for it to get extended, because I thought even if it's not working, but we should have something to keep accountable someone in the future if we wanted to. But then, so I think UN need to not act very contradictory too. People in New York are saying something, UNOMO in UCHO is saying another thing, UN Women is saying different thing, and there is no gender-sensitive monitoring of humanitarian aid to Afghanistan by any UN entity. UN Women is trying to do, but they don't have that much capacity and resources as other UN entities does. And honestly, the admin costs us very high. I hear WFP is charging 48% of the money on their admin cost. And that is like too much. So I think there is so much to sit and talk about the UN system and its delivering system too, because to meet the current reality. And then about the humanitarian aid going to Afghanistan, it's a very polarized issue, and it's very hard as someone that I know, maybe my cousin who doesn't have anything to eat tonight, to say that we should cut it. But what I am saying is, Taliban are collecting taxes heavily, right? Based on USIP's report, they had collected $400 million in the first half of 2022, right? So when we are sending the cash to Afghanistan, up to 80 million per week, we need to see how much money they have, push them to spend that on the services, and then maybe the international community cover the remaining. But they are like doing nothing to Afghanistan, to the people, and they're kind of keeping the international community blame or accountable for something that, hey, this miss is your responsibility, come and take responsibility of it. It's not, it's Taliban's responsibility, and we need to make sure that they do their job. So what I am saying is they are collecting money from that people, they have income, and that money is being spent on strengthening their military operations, their internal divisions of Kandahar and Kabul, are growing, and then I think the Kandahari people are spending a lot of money to create more military capacity to take care of themselves in Kandahar if there is a clash between them and Kabul people, because more of military resources and everything, I think, is based in Kabul, for example, the Ministry of Defense. So I think what we need to do is see how much we can push them. And then for the leverage, I'm not saying it is a leverage we can use, but there is room for it, to use it. Because when they started lashing on the streets, the aid got cut for a week or so, and then they have now stopped lashing people. They didn't allow primary education in Paktia and Paktika, I believe, and then there is a group of education activists and education organizations that are working with UNICEF and other organizations on the ground. They pushed for it. The aid was cut for 3 weeks, and they allowed primary education in those provinces. So we cannot say that there is no leverage in it. I think there is, but the thing is, if I agree with you guys that if the countries act as they should, so for example, I think US or maybe other countries want to push back because of the Ukraine and want the UNSC and UN to do the job. Russian and Chinese and UNSC is maneuvering their politics and interests. So I think there is so much that countries can act and do it, but they're not doing enough. if they want to, this money can be used as leverage too. That's my understanding, because that's what we hear inside Afghanistan. And then the second thing is, I think there hasn't been a proper monitoring of how UN is spending the money, and where is the room to change it. There's gonna be something till November, I believe, of UNOMA, but I don't know. But we are pushing for a gender expert there, and that's not even considered, right? So I think there are at least things that we can do that's not being done.
I completely agree with Metro on a couple of those points. In particular, you sort of talked about that community pressure. I didn't want to say there's no lever anywhere. I think if there is leverage, it lies with the Afghan people, not necessarily foreigners. There are people who have influence over the Taliban, but I don't think enough has been invested in trying to figure out, is it tribal elders from a certain place? And what will they use that leverage for? What kind of battles will they fight? You know, obviously, I think in some communities it's stronger, where if the Taliban cuts off education for girls, they're gonna continue on, or they're gonna push back, things like that.
Yeah.
So I don't want to be too hopeless about it.
Well, so I do want to ask this sort of question more about tools and resources than leverage. And we spent some time, I know, here in our program at CSIS and others, thinking about how the situation parallels the late 90s and early 2000s and this trajectory of Taliban increasing restrictions, cracking down. You alluded to this earlier, Vicky. But we're also living in a very different time. We're living in a very different era in terms of technological tools, for example, that are available that didn't exist or weren't widely accessible 20 plus years ago. And so I'm curious to hear from Vicky and Ella, how has the digital economy, how has digital technology changed the way, if at all, you're able to provide aid to support access, whether that's access to information remotely more easily than in person, where places it's difficult to move. Digital cash is certainly something that people have been talking about, cash transfers and things like that. How much has that been useful, if at all? And on the flip side, and I would love all of you to come in on this, are you seeing risks there as well in terms of the reports we saw early on of the Taliban exploiting databases full of personal information, or using technology to track people and target them for abuse and things like that?
In terms of the digital economy, it's not a viable alternative for Afghanistan. I mean, we've tried, experimented with digital cash as a way of delivering, and unless you're in a very urban center, or unless you're doing something very specific like paying salaries, it's just not there yet. And so you would again be leaving off a big portion of the population. I mean, even peri-urban, it's really difficult to do that.
And is that internet access, cell service? In other words, is that a place to make investments in to change that?
For example, if you gave someone digital cash, then you'd also have to set up all of the different service providers to be able to accept it. And then you're also removing choice from the person who receives the cash as to where they can go, where they can get it. We tried something like that with livelihoods, and it didn't quite work. So maybe if you're doing an urban distribution of cash, that might work a little bit better, but you're a long ways away from that being a panacea for Afghanistan. In terms of using it to mobilize and to raise awareness, it's almost having the opposite effect now. So as soon as you highlight something like, let's take the Paktia secondary girls' education when they opened the schools, and then people started putting that on social media, the Emir stopped that from happening. And you know, we are told by different Taliban officials, you can do this, don't publicize it. So I'm almost afraid to talk about what some of the solutions could be for women in a public forum, because as soon as they find out what those solutions are, then that puts a target on them.
Interesting. Yeah. Ella, anything to add?
No, nothing to add.
Yeah. Same. Metra, is that ecosystem worth investing in your view, at least in urban, peri-urban areas? We've certainly seen that in other environments take off as sort of an alternative. Yeah.
I agree with Vicky on this. It's not something very applicable. And the reason is a large population of Afghanistan, around 80%, live in rural areas. They don't have access to the means to use it, right? You need to have money to buy a good phone. You need to have money to have internet or, the phone services, to have access to the services, the first one. And the second one is there is a high chance that it get manipulated by the Taliban. That's what's happening, at least with some people that I work with or some groups, that even their WhatsApps are not safe anymore. Now imagine if they are using the services provided by the local cell phone providers or, for example, what I said, cell providers, right, services. So I think that first thing is not safe. Second thing is it's very costly at this time to make sure everyone has access to those means or educate them in use of that or make Afghanistan economy to adapt that thing. If it's like very cash based now and our banking system is not even working properly. But there are other ways that we can use, of course, technology, and that's in terms of more maybe coordination, getting connected with the local actors or women-led civil society organizations. It's, for example, maybe 20 years ago, it was very hard to find a woman to help you in Badakhshan or in Takhar or in Kandahar or in Bamiyan. Now it's easy. Right? I just need some people that we need some women, and then they know each other. You get to find 10 women from Badakhshan, from Mazar, from Helmand in a matter of hours. So I think those are the things that we can use it and just not rely that maybe we are here or we are in Kabul or we are, that's why we don't have access to those women in rural areas. I think that those are the ways that we can use it or provide them with some technology, safety trainings or something to do the job and be part of this process, but then making, for example, the delivery of it using technology. In the long term, I don't know, but I think now people don't have the means to use it. It's not feasible.
Yeah. I would also add on education for women. I think it's an alternative solution for some, just to ensure that there are some women that are still trained to be the next generation of healthcare workers or teachers. There are ways, we learned this in COVID. They use this as a form of education as well, using tablets offline, and then it's complicated and you can't do it at scale, but it is a way to, more should be invested in it because some is better than nothing.
Yeah, so we're getting some great questions from our online audience. I'm going to start with a couple of those, and then if folks in the room have questions, I'm not sure where our microphone is, but someone, there's a microphone here, so I'll have you raise your hand in just a minute, but let me bring in a couple questions from the online viewers. And so the first one is, do you think we moved too quickly to take advantage of the honeymoon period early on in the Taliban takeover, and in doing so, made mistakes that possibly played a role in triggering the restrictions we see today? Could we engage more cautiously earlier on? Is there a lesson to be learned there? I don't know
There's a lesson to be learned.
Yeah.
Like I did interviews with people, well, I won't say where, but who were talking about their reticence to engage the authorities in the first 6 months or a year. That's not true of everyone, but they didn't take advantage of that to learn about them, to better understand them, to perhaps then better understand what might have been coming, but also to start to kind of educate them about humanitarian principles, about these really basic things. And people might be cynical, like, what would they have cared anyway? But we'll never know. We'll never know. Because I think there wasn't that effort to sort of take it seriously and, okay, this is an authority that is now pretty much unopposed. We have to work with them. They've been a force in the sort of Afghan politics and conflict for the past 2 decades. This is an opportunity to have a conversation, to gather information, and to get across what we're doing, all of that came like a year and a half later. There's no concerted UN humanitarian engagement strategy action plan. It's all kind of reacting to each decree, each hit. And I think that is a missed opportunity. And that is a consequence of 20 years of being more aligned to the government or not investing in that neutrality principle. But I also think it's one that's, you can start now. You can start now and try and assess what you could be doing differently. I think there could be much stronger UN humanitarian diplomacy in the country and abroad that isn't reactive, that is much broader. Some organizations, MSF, IRC, do it much better because their track record in the country, and a lot of national organizations do it incredibly well because their track record in communities allows them to speak with this integrity and credibility to local authorities, to national authorities. Is that going to change this direction of travel, this path that we're on? No, but it's worth doing that to invest in what comes next, to invest in whatever the future holds, and make sure that you continue to press on things like humanitarian negotiations and the principles. And this morning we were talking a lot about humanitarian principles and the investment in it. Well, there isn't a lot of investment in frontline aid workers being trained on those kinds of things, and negotiations in these situations, or in providing mentoring or support. And those are the people who really, really, really need it right now.
Interesting. I'm just as sort of reframe the question to you. Was there a missed opportunity for engagement at a higher level on humanitarian issues early on? I think the question originally posed was, sort of, did humanitarians move too fast in expanding their work in maybe Afghanistan during this honeymoon period? But I guess the opposite question is also true. Was there a missed opportunity to engage at a political level on humanitarian issues early on? Would that have made a difference?
Yes,
Yeah.
and in fact, that was what I was going to say. I would flip that question, because I think we moved too fast in the other direction, where, shutting down Sehat Mandi, for example, instead of, keeping that going and taking a breath and maybe figuring out how to re-examine it. But also, many of the new programs that were then proposed were just the same exact programs that existed before, and were being proposed to just implement them without analyzing, like Ashley said, what the new situation is and how that would actually work. And then it took us a long time to figure out if anyone aside from humanitarians could talk to the Taliban leaders. So that let them set up a pattern when maybe if political action was taken earlier, it may have had an opportunity to go in a bit of a different direction. But to say, could the humanitarians have done more? I mean, the humanitarians were the only ones that were there. I think that's a little unfair.
I think there's also, you have to take into account, sorry, just quickly,
Yeah.
the Taliban's really suspicious of aid actors, and they have the worst possible view of aid actors as corrupt, as ineffective, as aligned to their enemies, and so on. So my sort of saying that there could be more engagement is not, this hope that it would radically change things, but it would. I've heard story after story of how that kind of engagement sort of allows space for a different conversation with a local official who could make your life impossible or shut down your program. And so that's why that engagement matters, I think.
So maybe at the local level. I think it's an important distinction probably between those local officials who maybe have not engaged with the international aid community versus the Taliban, who have spent plenty of time engaging with international actors
but
and
not the ministers and not a lot of the ones
Not
at the
all
top
of them,
level.
right,
Like
but
very few of them actually have. And
Yeah.
I think that's an important, it's not,
yeah, I just don't want to overestimate if we open their eyes to the benefits of humanitarian
not-
assistance,
yeah.
they would suddenly become welcoming of
No, I'm
of
not
our
saying
actions,
that, but I'm just
yeah.
sort of echoing Jan's comments this morning. It's what we do. It's what humanitarians do. You
Yeah.
keep talking.
Yeah. Let's go to the audience and see if there's any live questions from participants in the room. Just raise your hand and she will bring you a microphone. Yes, please.
Hi, Ellen Bevere from CARE. I think Vicky touched on a really important point earlier when she said that when we do localization, we're often just replicating INGO structures. And so my question for both Vicky and for, I'm so sorry, I forgot your name, Metra, sorry, is in the access negotiations that we're having sort of piecemeal at the local level, are we only making space for INGOs, or are we making spaces that can also be used by those sort of smaller, more subversive local NGOs that are more likely to represent women, people with disabilities, minorities, LGBTQ plus individuals, et cetera? Thank you.
Do you want to come in quickly and then we'll turn to Metra?
Because I think I didn't get the last part of the
Are we making space in that localization conversation? Are we really making space for really local actors, not just sort of big international NGOs that we're replicating on the ground? If I hopefully interpreted your question.
Are those negotiations that we're having at the local level, are those just benefiting INGOs, or are they benefiting local groups as well, like keeping space for?
When you're negotiating access, humanitarian access, are you really creating access for local actors or just the big international NGOs?
So I think it varies, the progress on that. And I think not enough of the international actors have local partners. So actually, IRC and CARE have a joint project where we have local NGOs running women's livelihood centers. And we've had some success. And when I say we should say those local actors themselves have had some success that after the ban have been able to reopen a couple of those women's centers, depending on their own. So we haven't been doing a great job negotiating on behalf of those local actors, and nor necessarily should we, but what we should do is be creating a space where they can negotiate on behalf of themselves if they ask for it and if they need that, particularly for women-led organizations who might get refused entry into a ministry. So that's when you need the international partners to go and then make an appointment and just take them with, and they won't get refused, or at least they haven't been in my experience, but we don't do enough of that.
So recently we have this discussion among us in Afghanistan that we are like, money of politicians had to change and become advocates because there is maybe space for them to at least do some advocacy for women of Afghanistan. And then that's why I think it's not fair that we expect the people who are actually doing the administrative and the execution of humanitarian work in Afghanistan to be politicians too, to do the negotiations a lot and all. So Vicky is definitely in a better position to answer that because she is more involved in this on the ground, or her team. But based on my experience, not really, because the humanitarian aid has been mostly administered and distributed by big organizations in the last 1.5 years. But I think conferences like this, and then everything we have done in the past 1.5 years have been so reactionary. Something has happened and you wanted to respond to that. And especially if it was severe and really worse and bad. And I think these platforms are maybe now is a good time that we sit and reflect, of what happened, where are the room that we need to work on. And I think one of those things is maybe the lessons learned, like Vicky mentioned, is this local organizations, mainly women-led, when they become subcontractors for the distribution, then they get their registration or permission or anything through these big organizations. If they go to these are our partners for application of this and that. Because based on an assessment I did on civil society 2 months ago, so Taliban are not saying that we don't, they have asked all local nonprofit organizations to re-register themselves with the Ministry of Economy. All of them should get certified again. They have been asked. They're like, there is no law to specifically says that women-led organizations won't be certified. But then the thing is when they go and send their applications, they never get approved. So maybe so there should be ways that they get the permission once they have funding or they have a job to do. And I think, or some other ways are like, this specific aid is for women, so women should distribute it. Or we have maybe one of the countries that have the largest number of widows in the world. So widows can be a target group for women aid workers to do the job. So I think there are rooms for it, but I personally don't see a fundamental work in the past 1.5 years. So hopefully these platforms be a chance that we reflect on that too.
Thanks, Etra. Any other questions from our in-person audience? I see one over here. And if there's any more, let's take the last couple. If there's one more, we can do them together. Nope, all right. I don't think it's on. There we go.
How about, there it is. Thank you both all for everything that you've been speaking regarding this issue in Afghanistan. I specifically wanted to target my question to Metra and to Vicky and Ella, if you don't mind. Quite a few things you've spoken about in this conversation has been about both being able to leverage aid and how certain doors have closed where others have opened, and trying to sort of navigate this very challenging morass. I wondered if perhaps you could speak on that within the health side, particularly as we're looking at vaccinations and polio, because I hear what many of you all have been saying, that some of this is political, some of this is leverage, and some of this is rather complicated, but it feels like that particular issue on health falls into a rather complicated space, and I wondered if you would give your inputs as to what you're seeing now within polio and the blocking off of women from being able to engage, who are really supporting in that area, if that falls within either one of those camps, and perhaps opportunities that you see moving forward where that could be improved. Thank you.
Ella, that's probably a question for you on vaccines.
You might know the polio one more specifically.
Sure.
The polio one is very complicated. So when the Taliban first took over, it actually got easier for a short period because the pockets of resistance were often in their areas. So in initial conversations with the MOPH, I think there was progress made. However, and now I can't remember timelines, right? So there was a period where women vaccinators in particular were being assassinated in certain areas. And I think ISK has now picked up the whole anti-vaccination part and sort of taken the lead from the Taliban on that. So it's still very dangerous to do vaccinations, but then you have had recently, in the last several months, the Emir has decided he doesn't like community health and mobile health teams. So that is how you primarily do vaccination. So a lot of work has to be done with, vaccinators are often couples, or brother, sister, husband, wife, father, daughter. There needs to be more education that it's not Western organizations. And when I say Western organizations, they also view Afghan NGOs as Western organizations quite often, and think that they're going around telling women how to divorce their husbands, not how to vaccinate. So there still needs to be a lot of education at the local level about vaccines and why they're important. So there hasn't been substantial improvement in that, I'm afraid.
Do you want to add?
I mean, I think to be clear, polio vaccination very specifically falls within the World Health Organization's remit, so it's not something that MSF is providing, but health is a unique sector in Afghanistan. It has been historically more, and when we look back in the 90s as well, it has been more protected as a space for women, and we have no guarantees that will continue, but it is an opportunity, and it remains the way that our staff are coming to work is they are saying we are working for MSF, we are going to the hospital. And that's a way that our staff are able to actually negotiate through situations where they might otherwise be harassed. And so I think the health sector is in a somewhat safer place. And part of that is because we have a humanitarian approach and we are working in a principled way. We are the doctors and nurses to the Taliban and their families, as well as to non-Taliban and their families. And that is a really important element that has always been part of our conversations and our negotiations with the Taliban. Before they took over, we were negotiating with them that they would honor and respect the way that we are working, that they would uphold the agreement that we had with the previous government when they took over, that they could understand and continue to protect those health spaces. And that's a really important, when we talk about depoliticizing aid, that's why. Because we need that space as humanitarians to say, we're not part of your political conversation, we are just here to provide medical care.
But you need to, can you just add on that?
quick, yeah.
Just really quick. We need to be careful by saying that health is a protected sector, because Taliban very much recognize health facilities as being a protected sector. When you're creating a community where it's getting harder and harder for women to leave their houses, community health is more important, mobile health is more important than ever if women are going to have equal access. And so we need to keep an eye on that.
Yeah, so that's...
And I mean, thank you, because that is a big concern, is that we see these attempts to erase women from public life, and that is one of the ways, is to intervene between women and their ability to seek that medical care.
So that's a good segue to the question I want to end to each of you with in just 1 minute or so, which is, I was going to ask you sort of project out 5 years, but I think that's way too far to be able to project in Afghanistan. But I want to ask you to project out a year from now in terms of what the situation might look like on the ground in terms of your operations, ability to work, the communities you're engaging with. What, if you have a sense of that, that you want to share where the direction of travel might be, and then what is one thing that you would like to see the humanitarian community do now to get ready for where we might be a year from now? So maybe I'll just go down the line. I'll start with Metra and give you the first shot at that.
It's very hard. I believe it won't change if we don't see any change at the political level. If there is no, bigger political discussion for resettlement or something, all people of Afghanistan agree on a government structure or something. But then it will get worse because Taliban are getting more established. They know the system well. They know how to use the institutions and the, physical power of their military to implement and get harsher on their restrictions or limitations. And then we are hearing that the Kandaharis is not, they are very fundamental in their beliefs. So he issued a decree based on what he believes in. And he is, I think, working a lot on building special forces around him to keep these things more restricted. So I think, hopefully, we need the international community, especially state actors, to act and there be a political negotiation or something. If not, I really see the coming year getting harder and harsher on everyone. And if the sue for the humanitarian aid workers, I don't see a brighter future if there is no political agreement on a bigger level, honestly.
No, I'd agree with all of that. I think it's going to get more difficult, which is not saying much. It's already incredibly difficult. But in order to prepare, I think it's about investing in, it's very hard to say what the future holds, but investing in the structures that we know will help Afghans survive whatever comes next. And that's in health, that's in community-based organizations, that's in women's organizations, and a lot of things that have, quite frankly, been neglected. And if we were to step back and look at, where donors are putting their money and really just blank slate, how could they work differently? This isn't an aspirational kind of police state, right? It's a really difficult operational environment. It's an environment of horrific humanitarian need. Okay, a lot of things aren't working. What could we be doing differently to better prepare, to better kind of respond to what comes next? Because I also feel there's a lot of sort of hopelessness, a kind of dread of people just would prefer to forget about Afghanistan, but that's not an option.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, Vicki?
I agree, it's going to get, if you're checking a 1-year timeline, it's going to get worse. I think this year is going to be dreadful for Afghans. But that does mean that we have to find ways, like Ashley said, that we need to find ways to sustain civil society in Afghanistan, because the change is only going to come from within. And if the Emir keeps going the way that he's going, Afghans aren't going to tolerate that long term. And there will be a solution. But let's continue. If we can't do secondary schools for girls, let's open up more primary schools, because, you know, the baseline for literacy in Afghanistan is still low, even after all of and because we couldn't get into many of these rural areas. So I think that could also help create a positive change in different areas of Afghanistan. So let's invest where we can actually make a difference. Let's figure out a way to actually get funding to truly local civil society and ensure that that doesn't fall apart. Because I think that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, whether that light is 3 years away or 5 years away. It cannot continue going down the path that it is. I just don't see Afghans tolerating that for eternity.
That's true. Yeah.
I'm not going to say that I am optimistic for the next 1 year. I think the comments around looking at the local level and what's possible is really important. And that's the only way forward, I think, is to think on a very local level, what can we do in this place at this time? To work where it's possible, to do what is possible, and to negotiate always for more. And that's essentially the only way I see us being able to continue as humanitarians in that short term.
Well, thank you all so much for the work that you are doing where it is possible to do it, and doing your best to make as much progress as you can in impossible circumstances. Thank you all very much for being here, and let's give them a round of applause.